It was a Wednesday morning when I first noticed it. The air in the chapel felt heavier than usual, as though something was pressing down on it. I couldn't pinpoint it at first, just an uncomfortable, lingering sensation that gnawed at the edges of my focus. The funeral service wasn't extraordinary by any means. Just another quiet morning with a grieving family, a simple casket, and the ritualistic routine that came with the job. But that day something didn't feel right. I've been a funeral director for more years than I care to count, but it wasn't until this particular service that I truly understood how much the dead can speak. They don't speak in words, of course, but in the subtle things that get under your skin, things you can't explain without sounding mad. Mrs. Evelyn Cartwright was the one we were laying to rest. A woman in her late 80s, a mother and a grandmother, passed after a long illness. The family was small, just a few children, a couple of grandchildren, and an old friend or two. Nothing unusual about her, at least not outwardly, but something about her casket stood out. It wasn't the shiny mahogany or the gold accents, though they were beautiful. No, it was the lock, a heavy brass mechanism that clicked shut so audibly when we sealed it. It was a sound I knew well, the familiar click of finality. But when I locked the casket that evening, there was something strange. It wasn't the usual satisfying click. It felt more reluctant, like the casket didn't want to close. I dismissed it. It was probably just me being tired, but as I prepared the chapel for the morning service, I noticed something strange. The flowers. They'd been arranged the night before, fresh lilies, roses, and chrysanthemums, their fragrance filling the room. But now, they were wilting. The petals were beginning to curl at the edges, the leaves drooping, and the air around the arrangement felt thick, almost suffocating. I touched them, expecting them to be dry and brittle, but they were still damp, as though they'd been freshly cut. I stood there for a moment, puzzled, before I decided to focus on the task at hand. I had a service to conduct, and I couldn't afford to get lost in oddities. But the unease didn't leave me. It clung to the air, even as the family began to file in for the service. There were no signs of distress from the family, just the quiet grief you'd expect. The eldest son stood by the casket, his eyes red from crying, while his younger sister held a handkerchief to her nose, trying to stifle a sob. I kept my distance, allowing them their space. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I kept glancing at the casket, at the lock, as though it were watching me. And then, something happened that I still can't explain. I was standing in the back of the chapel when I saw it, a faint glimmer of light bouncing off the casket's brass lock. I squinted, confused. The casket had been sealed the night before. There was no reason for it to be gleaming now. My eyes darted to the family. No one was near it, but there it was again, a flash of light from the lock. I walked over, carefully stepping through the rows of chairs to get a better look. That's when I saw it. The lock was slightly ajar. It wasn't much, just a hairline gap where the mechanism had shifted, but it shouldn't have been possible. The lock had clicked shut with such finality the night before. I knew it hadn't been tampered with, and yet, here it was, open. I could feel my heart race. It wasn't just the lock that disturbed me, was the fact that the family hadn't noticed. They hadn't noticed anything. The eldest son was still standing, eyes cast downward, while his sister whispered to a relative. There was no way they could have seen the lock open. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, and yet, it was there, undeniable. I tried to calm myself, but my hands were shaking as I reached down to close it. That's when the smell hit me. It was faint at first, just a whisper of something metallic, like rust and blood, but it grew stronger as I stood there, bending over the casket. My stomach turned. The scent wasn't coming from the flowers, no, it was coming from the casket itself. The same casket that had been sealed the night before. The same casket that now seemed to hum with a presence I couldn't explain. I stepped back, my head swimming. The service was still going on. The family hadn't noticed, but I couldn't stand there any longer. I had to do something. I excused myself and stepped into the back office, hoping to collect my thoughts. But when I sat at my desk, I realized the unsettling truth. I had never locked the casket properly. The lock had never truly clicked into place. I stared at the file on my desk, the one that contained all the details about Mrs. Cartwright, the same file that had the address of the family's home, the time of the service, and the details of the floral arrangements. But there was something wrong with the file. It had been placed out of order, flipped upside down. I stood, feeling cold all over. The air in the office was thick, suffocating, and as I turned to the window, I saw the same glimmer of light from the chapel, flashing across the glass. My heart lurched. No one was supposed to be out there. The chapel was empty, but there it was, the faintest movement outside the window. A figure, just standing, watching. I rushed to the window, but by the time I looked out, the figure was gone. The service ended without incident, and the family left quietly, as they always do, but I stayed behind, as I always do. I checked the casket once more, confirming that the lock was now firmly in place, but the air around it was thick with an unsettling energy, as if something had been disturbed, but wasn't quite ready to leave. I couldn't shake the feeling that Mrs. Cartwright hadn't really left. I couldn't explain it, but I knew she was still there, watching, waiting, and I would never forget that look, the one I saw through the window. The pale, thin face, pressed against the glass, eyes wide open, staring back at me. Some things, once they are seen, can never be unseen. The funeral home was quiet, almost too quiet, as I stood in the dimly lit office that had become so familiar to me over the years. It wasn't just the silence that unsettled me, was the weight of the air, heavy with something unspoken, something I couldn't quite place. I had been in the business long enough to know when something felt off, but I didn't know what it was this time. That particular morning had started like any other. The chapel was prepared for a small service for a local man, Thomas Weaver, a mechanic who had passed away in his sleep. He was in his mid-70s, and there had been no great fanfare to his life, no extravagance in his passing. The family was small, just his daughter, his wife, and a few old friends. A simple affair. It had been a rough night, as these things sometimes go. The embalming had gone without issue, the makeup and clothing set, the casket prepped, everything ready by midnight. We sealed the casket before I left, as always, but there was something odd about that lock. When I clicked it shut, it didn't have the usual firm snap. It was almost like the lock had hesitated, like it was resisting. I blamed it on my tiredness. Of course, no way would I let myself entertain thoughts of anything strange happening, but it was enough to set my nerves on edge. When I arrived at the chapel that morning, I immediately sensed something different in the air. The familiar scent of wax from the candles and fresh flowers seemed heavier today, almost too sweet. The lilies in the arrangements by the front were wilting, even though they had been freshly delivered that morning. The roses, too, had started to curl at their edges, their normally vibrant colors dulling into an unnatural brown. It was only 9 a.m. too soon for flowers to be wilting. I shook off the unease, told myself it was just a product of the heat from the candles or the humidity in the air. Maybe something was wrong with the HVAC system. But as I moved to the back office to check the service folder, I saw it's something I couldn't explain. The casket was not in its usual position. It had been moved slightly. I walked over to it, feeling a tightening in my chest. The lock on the casket had been tampered with. It was ajar just enough that I could see the faintest glimpse of the lining inside. No one had touched it. I had double-checked everything before I left last night. My hands went cold. This wasn't right. I walked back to the office to check the security footage. Nothing had been disturbed when the staff left for the night. The cameras showed no movement, no one approaching the casket. I tried to calm myself. I must be imagining things. But as I stared at the footage, something in the corner of the frame caught my eye. A shadow, a movement. I rewound it. Nothing. I watched again, and there it was, a flicker. It was so quick, a mere instant, but unmistakable. Someone had passed by, and the shadow, it seemed wrong, out of place. I could hear the staff starting to arrive for the service, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I had to get a closer look. As I approached the casket, I noticed something else, the faintest trace of something on the casket's surface. Something sticky, like tar, or sap, or blood. I had to stop myself from going further down that thought. I reached for the lock, hoping to secure it again. But the moment my fingers touched the metal, the temperature in the room seemed to drop. The lock felt cold against my skin, unnaturally so. I quickly clicked it shut, but the air around me seemed to hum, as though something was pressing in on me. I turned to leave, hoping to regain some composure before the family arrived, but something made me stop. The scent. That metallic sweetness again. I followed the scent, as it seemed to lead me back to the casket. The casket's lid ... It was shifting. I saw it move, just slightly. A small rise in the wood, as though something inside was pushing up. I froze, my breath caught in my throat. My mind screamed at me to step away, to just leave it alone, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the floor. The doorbell rang, and I heard the family arrive. It broke my trance, and I snapped back to reality. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to clear the image from my mind. I straightened up, wiped my hands on my pants, and forced myself to greet them. "I understand," I said, but I wasn't sure if she understood. She looked as though she were trying to convince herself as much as me. The service ended, and I stayed behind, as always, to handle the paperwork and final details. I walked the hallways, checking the locks, ensuring everything was in place. The air was thick with the scent now so overpowering that I had to fight the urge to gag. I lifted the lid. Inside, there was no body, no sign of the man who had been laid to rest just hours before. But there was something there, something that didn't belong. A small, crumpled note, stained with dark ink, lay in the middle of the casket, resting where the body should have been. I picked it up, my hands trembling. The words were written hastily, in a scrawl I could barely read. "You shouldn't have opened it. I'm still here. I don't know what happened next. I just know I ran." I've seen more things in this line of work than most people could even imagine, but nothing has ever come close to the events of that Thursday morning. If I hadn't experienced it myself, I wouldn't have believed it. I wouldn't have let myself, but now I can't unsee it, and I can't shake the feeling that the dead don't always stay gone. It started like any other routine day. The sun had barely started to break through the fog when I arrived at the chapel. The air was damp, thick with moisture from the overnight rain, but the cold didn't bother me. I've spent years in this building. It's familiar, comforting in its own way. But that morning, it felt off. It was subtle at first, just the air too still, too quiet. The kind of silence that feels like something is waiting for you to notice it. The service for Samuel Briggs was scheduled for the afternoon. He was in his late 60s, a retired schoolteacher, passed away unexpectedly after a sudden illness. The family wasn't large, and there was nothing extraordinary about the service. Just another simple affair, another body to prepare, another family to guide through their grief. But something happened when we moved the body into the chapel. Samuel's casket was a deep mahogany, one of the heavier ones, with brass trim and a simple lock, nothing fancy. We had sealed it the night before, checked it twice. As we always do, I personally locked it, clicking the mechanism shut. It had been secure when I left. But now, when I moved the casket into place for the service, I noticed something strange. The locket was open. I stood there in the cool, dim light of the chapel, staring at the lock, my breath catching. I hadn't touched it since last night. There was no reason for it to be open. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it wasn't fully locked. Maybe the mechanism had failed. But I had double-checked it last night. There was no way. I didn't know what to do. The family would be arriving soon, and I didn't want to alarm them, but I couldn't just leave it like this. I reached for the lock to secure it, but the moment my fingers brushed against the cold metal, I froze. A low, guttural groan came from inside the casket. At first I thought it was my imagination. The tiredness, the long hours, the stress of the job, it could have been anything. But then, it happened again. A long, drawn-out, barely audible sound, like something shifting inside the casket. My hands began to tremble. I took a step back, heart pounding in my chest. The room felt colder now, the air thick with tension. And then, the smell. It wasn't the usual faint scent of flowers or embalming fluid. No, this was something heavier, more metallic, more unnatural. The smell of decay, of something that shouldn't be. It clawed at my senses, and for a moment I thought I might suffocate from it. I turned to leave, to check on the family, but something caught my eye, a shadow, moving across the back of the chapel. I blinked, but when I looked again, it was gone. There was no one there. The place was empty. I hurried out to the office, trying to steady my breath. This wasn't right. I had to check the cameras, make sure I wasn't losing my mind. But when I opened the security footage, it made my stomach drop. The camera in the chapel had captured everything, including the moment I placed the casket in its position. But then, as I walked away, the footage showed something I couldn't explain. I jumped back from the screen. My hands were slick with sweat. I wasn't imagining this. I wasn't. I grabbed the phone, intending to call my assistant to get help, but I stopped. The family was about to arrive, and I couldn't afford to look unprofessional. I forced myself to calm down and returned to the chapel, pretending nothing was wrong, but the air in their ear was suffocating now, thick with something that I couldn't place. The family arrived soon after, as I expected. They moved slowly toward the casket, somber, their eyes red with grief. But as they gathered around, something else happened. The smell intensified, so much so that I could see the family starting to shift uncomfortably. I watched as the widow, Samuel's wife, placed a hand on the edge of the casket, and then she froze. Her face went pale, and she pulled her hand back as if burned. "It smells like death," she whispered, looking at me with wide eyes. I forced a smile, but it didn't reach my eyes. "It's just the flowers, ma'am. I'll get them changed after the service." But the family didn't seem to believe me. I watched them, their eyes flickering nervously toward the casket, as though they could sense something was wrong. I wanted to move them along, keep things moving, but the air around us grew heavier, thicker, suffocating in a way that made it hard to breathe. When the service finally ended, and the family left to go to the reception, I stayed behind. As always, I needed to secure the casket again, to make sure everything was in place. As I walked into the chapel, I saw it, the casket lid. It had shifted again. I didn't know how, but it was open, just slightly. My heart began to race. I had locked it. I knew I had. I had heard the click the night before. I approached the casket cautiously, my hands shaking. I could feel the weight of something pressing in on me, the room closing in. I reached for the lid to close it, but before I could, I heard a sound of soft, rasping breath, like a long drawn-out sigh from deep within. I froze. It wasn't possible. Samuel was gone. He couldn't be alive. But then I saw it. The body inside the casket. Samuel's body shifted. His hand, pale and cold, twitched. His fingers curled, ever so slightly, as though he was waking from a long, unnatural sleep. His eyes, once closed, cracked open, just a sliver. And in that moment, the world around me seemed to crumble. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. All I could do was watch as Samuel's body slowly, impossibly, started to sit up. His head lolled to the side, his mouth opening, and that's when I saw it. The thing that was now wearing his face, it wasn't Samuel. It couldn't have been. I stumbled backward, horrified, as the thing inside the casket let out a low, wet laugh. The laughter echoed in my mind, a sound that would haunt me forever. I bolted from the chapel, slamming the door behind me, but the laughter, it didn't stop. It never stopped. I never went back. Per se in this line of work, you get used to things, to the smell, the routine, the grief. But I can't unsee what I saw that day. Some things, once they've been seen, can never be unseen. And I learned the hard way that not all the dead stay buried. It's a job that teaches you to be calm under pressure. A funeral director is expected to remain collected, to take care of all the details, and to ensure that the families can grieve in peace. But there are some things you can't prepare for, things that are beyond reason. And I'll tell you, this one took me right to the edge of my sanity. It all began with the funeral of Edward Whitmore, a man in his early 80s, a retired accountant, passed away after a long battle with cancer. The service was going to be a small, quiet affair. His daughter and a few close friends were the only ones attending. The casket was a simple, classic oak with brass handles, nothing too fancy, but solid and respectable. I had arranged everything the night before, the embalming, the preparation, the floral arrangements, and of course, locking the casket. It was the final touch to make sure everything was secure before I left for the evening. But when I arrived early that morning, something wasn't right. The chapel had an odd heaviness to the air, almost as if something were pressing down on the room, suffocating it. I didn't think much of it. It was just a feeling, a product of the long hours and the grief I'd been around. But the moment I entered the prep room, the unease settled deeper in my bones. I was the first one there. The staff hadn't arrived yet, and the family wasn't due until later in the morning. The only sound was the hum of the air conditioning and the faint rustling of papers on my desk. But then, there was another sound, a soft click, almost like a lock turning. I turned to look, but nothing seemed out of place. The casket was in the same spot where I had left it. I'd locked it myself, and there was no reason for it to be open. But when I walked over to check, my heart dropped. The locket was undone. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the brass lock. It had been securely fastened the night before. There was no reason for it to be open now. I checked the casket, the seal, the hinges all in place. But the lock, it had been turned, as if someone had come in during the night and unlocked it. I immediately went into a panic, thinking maybe one of my staff members had been in early to prepare the room. But I checked with each of them, none had touched it. I tried to calm myself. It had to have been a mistake. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly. I fixed it and closed the lid, pushing the thought out of my mind. but the nagging feeling wouldn't go away. The air was still thick, and the silence in the room was beginning to feel oppressive. I went about preparing the room, setting up the flowers, ensuring everything was in place. But as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I couldn't explain it, just a prickling on the back of my neck, the sensation of eyes on me. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. Just the casket, now locked and still. By the time the family arrived, I had mostly shaken off the feeling. They moved quietly toward the casket, a few murmurs of grief breaking the silence as they reached for the handles, offering their final respects. I stayed in the back, as I always do, monitoring from a distance. But again, I couldn't escape the sensation that something was wrong. The air, still thick and oppressive, seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. I kept my eyes on the family, but they didn't notice. They were focused on Edward, on their grief. But then, the smell hit me. It was faint at first, barely noticeable. A soft, metallic scent, like copper or iron. I told myself it was just the flowers, or perhaps the humidity from the rain outside. But as the service went on, the scent grew stronger, heavier. It hung in the air, thick and suffocating. By the time the service ended, it was so overpowering I could taste it on the back of my throat. I excused myself and stepped out of the room to take a breath. That's when I heard it, a soft, wheezing sound, coming from the chapel. I froze. I knew what I had heard. It was a breath. Not a gasp, not the faint exhale of someone in deep grief. It was the sound of lungs filling with air, of something breathing. And it came from inside the casket. My mind screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to walk away, but my feet were rooted to the spot. I had to know what was going on. I couldn't ignore it. My hand shook as I reached for the door handle. It was cold, colder than it should have been, like the chapel had been holding its breath right along with me. I pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking under the weight of the stillness in the room. The family had already left for the reception. The chapel was empty, except for me and the casket. I walked toward it, my heart pounding in my chest. The lock was still intact, the lid shut tightly, but that sound had come from inside. I took a deep breath and, with trembling hands, reached for the casket's lid. I don't know why I did it. I don't know what possessed me. But I pulled the latch open, and as soon as I did, the breath stopped. For a moment, everything was silent. Then I saw it. Edward Whitmore's body had shifted. Not much, just a small, subtle movement, but enough to make my blood run cold. His arms, once folded neatly across his chest, were now hanging loosely at his sides. His head, once angled slightly toward the side, had turned, just enough. Just enough to make it look like he was staring right at me. I couldn't breathe. I backed away, my feet stumbling over the floor, my heart racing. But before I could turn to leave, his cold, lifeless hand moved. It wasn't a twitch, it wasn't an involuntary spasm, it was deliberate. His hand reached out, fingers stretching toward me. I don't remember running. I don't remember anything after that. The next thing I knew, I was outside, gasping for air, my hands shaking, my legs unsteady beneath me. I couldn't go back in. I couldn't face it. The family came back in the afternoon, and I don't know what happened to the body after that. I left, I walked out, and I never returned. To this day, I don't know what I saw in that chapel. I don't know what was happening to Edward's body. But I know one thing for sure, whatever it wasn't natural. It was something else, something that shouldn't be, and it will haunt me forever. Sometimes, when the wind howls outside at night, I swear I can still hear that breath, that wheezing sound, just waiting to fill the air again. The chapel was quiet when I arrived that morning, too quiet. It wasn't the kind of silence I was used to. Usually, there was a peacefulness that settled in, like the calm before a storm. But today, it felt like something was pressing in on me, suffocating me in ways I couldn't explain. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the task at hand, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It had been a rough night. The family had arrived late the evening before for the pre-service viewing. The deceased was an older man, Andrew Patterson, in his late 70s. He had passed unexpectedly from a heart attack. The family wasn't large, just his son and a few close relatives. They seemed like decent people, quiet and reserved. Nothing about the night had stood out as strange. But I'd been working non-stop for days, and I was starting to feel the fatigue creep in. I had made sure everything was in place, the flowers, the casket, the preparation of the body. The casket was one of the heavier models, dark walnut with gold accents. Simple, dignified. I locked it securely, the brass lock clicking shut with that reassuring finality. I remember standing there for a moment, staring at the casket. There was something about it that didn't sit right, but I blamed the exhaustion. When I arrived that morning to prepare for the service, I felt it again. That oppressive feeling. The air in the chapel was thick, like it was holding its breath. I tried to shake it off as I went about my duties, but as I made my way down the hall to check the casket, I felt a cold shiver run up my spine. The locket was open. I stood there in disbelief for a moment, staring at the brass mechanism. It was impossible. I had locked it the night before. I had double-checked it. No one had been in the chapel after the viewing, but there it was, just a tiny crack. The lock undone. My heart began to race. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I hadn't locked it properly, I thought. Maybe the mechanism had malfunctioned. I reached for the lock to secure it again, but when my hand touched it, I felt the strangest sensation. It was cold, much colder than it should have been. A chill ran through my fingers, deep into my bones. I tried to ignore the growing unease and shut the casket, but then, I heard it, a soft sound, like a faint sigh. It came from inside the casket. I froze. It wasn't a noise from outside. It wasn't the air conditioning kicking on or a draft moving through the building. No, this was something else, something I couldn't explain. I stepped back, my breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I almost turned to run, but then, I heard the noise again. A sigh, deeper this time, followed by a soft rustling sound, like someone was shifting inside the casket. I wasn't sure what to do. Every part of me told me to call someone, to get help, but I was too afraid to leave the room. I couldn't bring myself to take my eyes off the casket. The air felt heavier now, oppressive, as if the room itself was waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear, but finally, I walked toward the casket. Every step felt like it took me further from the safety of reason. I reached for the lid, my hand trembling, and I started to lift it. And then I heard it again, the rustling inside the casket, but this time, it wasn't a sigh. It was a movement, a deliberate, slow shift. My heart skipped a beat. I should have run, should have screamed, but I didn't. I couldn't. Something had a hold of me. I had to know. I pulled the lid open further, my breath shallow in my chest. I couldn't see anything at first, just the pale, lifeless body of Andrew Patterson lying there, exactly as I had prepared it the night before. But then, as I looked closer, I saw it. His hand, it twitched, just slightly. I couldn't breathe. My pulse hammered in my ears. I stumbled back, but before I could turn away, the hand moved again. It wasn't a spasm, it was a deliberate motion. His fingers curled, ever so slightly, toward me. I turned and ran. I don't know how I got out of the chapel. I don't know how I found my way back to the office. But I was there, locked inside, my body trembling uncontrollably. I didn't know what had just happened, but I knew one thing for sure. The dead were not supposed to move. I didn't want to go back. I didn't want to face whatever I had just witnessed. But I had a responsibility. I had a job to do. I couldn't just leave. The family would be arriving soon, and I had to be there. When they walked in, everything looked normal. They were somber, quiet. They moved toward the casket to pay their respects. I stayed back, watching from a distance, trying to hide my unease. But as they gathered around the casket, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. One of the relatives, their daughter, I think, was standing at the head of the casket, staring down at her father. She looked pale, her face frozen in an expression of confusion. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out. She turned to me, her eyes wide. "What's wrong with him?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. I didn't understand what she meant at first, but then I saw it. Her father's eyes, once closed, were open, just slightly, but enough to see the white around the edges. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't speak. I wanted to explain, to tell her that everything was fine, but I couldn't. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. The daughter stepped forward, reaching for the casket lid, but as she did, I saw her father's lips move. Not a twitch, not an involuntary muscle spasm. His lips parted slightly, as though he were trying to speak. I didn't wait to see any more. I turned and fled the chapel, never looking back. To this day, I don't know what happened in that room. I don't know if it was my mind playing tricks on me, or if something else, something far darker was at play. But I do know this. I never went back to that chapel after that day. I never went back to that job. Sometimes, when the wind howls through the trees at night, I swear I can hear someone whispering my name. And every time I do, I feel that same chill. The one I felt when I opened the casket that morning. The one that tells me that sometimes the dead don't stay buried. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories. And remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.